Hi everyone, my name is Lauren Hayes. I'm 36 years old. I live in a small house in Raleigh, North Carolina, with two rescue cats named Biscuit and Fig. A garden that I started from a single pot of basil that I bought on a whim on a Saturday afternoon, and a life that I genuinely love, which is something I could not have said 2 years ago without feeling like I was telling myself a story I didn't quite believe. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who shared something like this publicly. I'm private by nature. I've always been the kind of woman who processes things quietly, who keeps her hardest moments close, who moves forward without making too much noise about what she left behind. My mother used to say I had the emotional range of a library, quiet on the outside, absolutely everything happening on the inside. But something has been sitting with me, something I cannot keep to myself any longer, and I want to be clear about why I'm sharing this, because it matters to me that you understand. It's not about revenge, though there was a time when I wanted that very badly. It's not about anger, though I felt that too for a long time, the kind that sits in your chest and hums. It's because I know that somewhere out there, right now, tonight, there is a woman lying in a hospital bed being abandoned by the person who promised to stay. And I want her to know what is on the other side of that pain. So let me tell you what happened to me. All of it. Because the ending, the actual ending, is something that nobody in this story could have predicted. Not me, not Daniel, and not Cassandra. Stay with me. I met Daniel Hayes when I was 24 years old at a mutual friend's birthday dinner in Charlotte. He was tall and funny and had that very specific, very disarming charm that makes you feel like you are the most interesting person in any room you happen to be standing in. He remembered details. He asked real questions, the follow-up kind that make you feel like you're actually being heard. He called when he said he would call. He showed up when he said he would show up. We dated for 2 years. Easy, falling in love years, the kind you look back on later and try to read for things you missed. He was occasionally distant, occasionally hard to reach emotionally, but I attributed that to temperament. He was an introvert. He worked long hours in corporate finance, and I told myself that was just the industry, the culture, the particular demands of the world he operated in. He proposed on a Tuesday evening in a cabin we'd rented in the Smoky Mountains. Not a holiday, not an anniversary, a random Tuesday. He said he didn't want to do it on a special occasion because he wanted the moment itself to be the occasion, not borrowed significance from something else, but its own thing entirely. I thought that was the most romantic thing I had ever heard in my life. I said yes before he had finished the sentence. We married in September. 22 tables. Late garden flowers in amber and gold. An open bar that ran 2 hours over what we paid for, and nobody complained. His mother cried during the vows. The real kind of crying. The kind a person can't stop even when they're trying to. My father danced until his back gave out and then kept dancing because he said the song was too good to stop for something as minor as a spine. It was perfect. Genuinely, fully perfect. The kind of day that becomes the measurement against which other days are compared. And for years after that, a long stretch of years that felt solid and real, the marriage felt like that day. Warm. Safe. Like we had figured out something that a lot of people spend their whole lives chasing. We bought a house in Raleigh. Daniel moved up at the firm. I built a freelance graphic design business that started small and grew steadily, year by year, with the patient kind of growth that you have to tend and believe in. We talked about children in that half-committed, soft-focus way that couples do when the door is open but nobody's ready to walk through it yet. We had friends, a routine, a rhythm, a shared language. I am telling you all of this, spending this time on the good version of it, because I need you to understand what I thought I had. I need you to feel the weight of it, the genuine fullness of a life that felt real and safe, so that you can understand what it meant when it started to come apart. Because it happened slowly. That is the thing about the way Daniel operated. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself. It was a slow leak. the kind that works so gradually you don't notice the water level dropping until you look up one day and realize the pool is almost empty. And I, who considered myself observant and self-aware and smart about people, I did not see it coming. It started in January. I found a lump. I want you to really sit inside that moment with me, because it was one of the most profound experiences of my life, the way that very frightening things sometimes are. I was in the shower, half awake, running through my mental checklist for a client call I had in an hour. And then my hand stilled, and my breathing stilled, and in the space of about 4 seconds, every single thing that had seemed important 30 seconds ago became completely irrelevant. I stood there under the hot water and I thought, please no. I didn't tell Daniel right away. I told myself I was being practical, that there was no point in frightening him before I had any concrete information, that the responsible thing was to wait. And that was partially true. But there was something else underneath that, something I'm only able to see clearly now from this distance. Some quiet, intuitive part of me was already watching him, already holding itself back, as though something very deep inside me already knew something my conscious mind hadn't caught up to yet. I can't explain that except to say it was there, that instinct, that watchfulness, before I had any real reason to feel it. I went to my GP alone. She sent me to a specialist alone. I had my imaging done alone, sitting in a paper gown in a white room, watching a technician's completely neutral face and getting nothing. 10 days after the biopsy, the results came back. Stage 3 breast cancer. Aggressive. Treatment to begin as soon as possible. My oncologist, Dr. Ewan, was one of the clearest, most direct people I have ever encountered. She gave me information the way you give information to someone you respect, without softening it into something more comfortable than it was, without drowning it in qualifiers. I sat in her office and I thought, I should probably be crying. I wasn't. I was very still, the way you get when something is too large to process in real time, when your brain is simply receiving and recording and hasn't started interpreting yet. I drove home. I sat in the driveway for 20 minutes looking at the front of my own house, the house I had painted, the garden bed I had half started and abandoned, the door I came through every day, and I just looked at it. Then I went inside. I found Daniel in the kitchen. I sat at the table and I told him. He went white. He came to me immediately. He put his arms around me and held on, and he said the right things, the exactly right things, which is something Daniel was always very skilled at. He said we would get through this. He said he was here, completely here, whatever I needed. That night we sat up very late together. We cried. We looked things up on my laptop. We made a list of questions for the doctors. We went to bed and he held me close, and I thought, okay, this is going to be terrifying, but we're going to go through it together. If I had known that night was the last warm night, the last night I would feel genuinely held by this marriage, I would have pressed every detail of it into my memory. I would have held it more carefully, because it was the night before everything quietly shifted and I didn't know it was the last of anything. I just thought it was the worst Tuesday of our lives so far, and that more terrible Tuesdays were coming, but that we'd get through them the way married people do. It started so slowly that I kept talking myself out of what I was seeing. About 2 weeks after my diagnosis, Daniel started working late. One night, then two, then 4 nights in a week. He had a big account. Bad timing, he said. And that phrase, bad timing, landed so strangely against the backdrop of what was happening to my body that I actually felt a brief surreal flash of almost humor. Bad timing. I have stage 3 cancer. The situation is fully established. Your absence from it is simply a choice you are making and calling by a different name. But I said nothing, because I was scared and exhausted and I didn't want to spend the limited energy I had on a confrontation I wasn't sure I could finish. When he was home, he was present only in the most physical sense. He sat at the table with his phone. He answered questions in short, complete sentences that gave me nothing extra. He stopped sitting close to me on the couch. He stopped touching my arm when he walked by. None of it was dramatic. There was nothing I could point at and say, "Look, there, that is the thing." It was more like watching something go out of focus. The definition just slowly blurring, day by day. I started chemotherapy in February. If you've been through it, I don't need to describe it. If you haven't, let me try. Your body becomes the site of something enormous. The treatment that is saving your life is also, in a very real sense, taking it apart. The exhaustion is not the sleepy kind, it's something deeper, something that reaches your bones and stays there. Your appetite disappears. Your hair comes out in the shower, at first in small amounts that you tell yourself are normal, then in amounts that make you sit on the bathroom floor for a while without getting up. Your face changes. The person you see in the mirror is recognizable as you, but different in ways that are hard to articulate, hollower, paler, unfamiliar in small but accumulating ways. And through all of that, every infusion, every night of nausea, every morning I looked in the mirror at someone who barely resembled who I'd been, I needed Daniel. He was not there. Not really. Not in the way that counts. He came to the first 2 or 3 infusions, then he started having conflicts. Then he stopped coming entirely, and the reasons were always just plausible enough. Work, a deadline, a meeting, that I couldn't point at one of them directly and say, "This one is a lie." But the cumulative weight of all of them was unmistakable. My best friend Priya started driving me to chemo. She would sit beside me during 4-hour infusions with her laptop, working, not making a big production of it, just there. My mother came down from Virginia and stayed for a month. My neighbor Karen, a woman whose name I had known for 4 years, but who I had spoken to barely a dozen times beyond hello, started leaving food on my porch without announcing it. Casseroles, lentil soup, banana bread wrapped in foil with a small handwritten note folded underneath. The note said things like, "Thinking of you today. No need to respond. Just wanted you to know." The generosity of people who owed me nothing. While my husband became a polite, distracted stranger in his own house, I built excuses for him in my head because the alternative was too much to hold alongside everything else I was carrying. He was scared. He was processing badly. He didn't have the language for this kind of fear. I was very understanding, very patient, very generous with my interpretations. I was also, underneath all of that, already beginning to understand something I was not yet ready to name. I was not snooping. I want to say that clearly because it matters to me. It was a Saturday morning. I was on the couch, doing the specific kind of exhausted resting that chemo makes you do, not quite sleeping, not quite awake, just lying there being present in your body. Daniel was in the shower. My phone was charging in the bedroom. I needed to check the time. I picked up his phone from the coffee table. The screen was lit up with a notification. The message preview was visible. "Can't stop thinking about last night. When can I see you again? I miss you already." The name on the notification was Cassandra P. I put the phone back down very carefully, the way you set something down when you're afraid of what might happen if your hands aren't steady. I walked to the kitchen. I turned the cold water on full and I held my wrists under it for a long time. My heartbeat was very loud. The kitchen was very quiet. Then I dried my hands. I folded the dish towel and put it back on the oven handle. And I went and got my own phone and checked the time, 9:14. I spent the next 3 days doing something that I can only describe as rereading, going back through months of behavior. The late nights, the phone face down, the brief answers, the emotional withdrawal, and watching it all rearrange from something I had been interpreting generously into something I had not been willing to see. It was like one of those images that looks like one thing until you look at it differently, and then you can't unsee the other shape. I had been looking at it one way, now I was seeing the other shape, and I understood with a cold and absolute clarity that I had been seeing it wrong for a very long time. I gave myself 3 days. On the third night, I sat him down at the kitchen table. I had made tea, both of us, 2 mugs, which I think confused him because the kitchen felt almost domestic and ordinary. I set the muns on the table. I sat across from him. And I said, without any preamble, I saw the message from Cassandra. He looked at the table. His jaw did something complicated. He picked up his mug and set it back down without drinking. And then, very slowly, he talked. He said he had been struggling, that he had feelings for someone at work, that it had started emotionally and become something more, and that he hadn't known how to tell me, and that the timing, and he paused on the word, clearly aware of how it sounded, that the timing had made everything impossible. That our marriage had been experiencing disconnection before my diagnosis, and that the diagnosis had, in his words, accelerated a process that was already in motion. He used the word process to describe the dissolution of our marriage. While I was on chemotherapy, he had found a clinical word for it, had smoothed it down into something that sounded like paperwork, like a project update, like a business situation that had unfortunately developed. I looked at this man across a table in the kitchen of the house we had bought together. This man whose mother had cried at our wedding. This man whose hand I had held in this same kitchen 100 times. And I thought with absolute clarity, you have had this speech ready. You have rehearsed this. And right now you are delivering the version in which my illness is context for your choices, rather than a thing you chose to abandon. I put down my tea. I said, Daniel, I'd like you to leave. I want you out of this house within 48 hours. I'll be filing for divorce when I'm physically stable enough to do it without it interfering with my treatment, and I expect you to cooperate fully. I'm not going to spend a single day of my illness managing your guilt or negotiating my own dignity. He tried to talk. He said he didn't want to leave me while I was sick. He said it would look terrible, which I found to be an extraordinary thing to say, that his primary concern in this moment was how it would look. He said maybe they could. I said, please don't make me say it a third time. He left the next morning. I stood in the kitchen after I heard his car pull out of the driveway, and I waited for myself to fall apart. I had been terrified of this moment, of being genuinely, structurally alone in the worst experience of my life. I expected to crumble. What happened instead was strange and quiet. I felt the air in the house change, like something that had been held too tightly, pressed too hard into a space too small for it, had finally been given room. I made a cup of tea. I sat at the kitchen table in the morning light coming through the window over the sink, and I thought, it is just you now, Lauren. What are you going to do with that? Something inside me answered, everything. The months that followed were the hardest of my life, and I am not going to dress that up or speed through it, because the hard parts are the real parts and they deserve to be told properly. Chemotherapy continued. There were infusions that put me horizontal for 3 days afterward. There was a hospitalization in March. 5 days, low white cell count, my body needing intervention. And Priya slept in the chair by my bed on 2 of those nights, and we put on bad reality television and didn't talk much, and it was exactly, precisely right. There were scans with the terrible, specific quality of medical waiting, that low-level dread that becomes the background hum underneath every other thought. There were nights alone in a house that felt too large for one person, too quiet, too full of the absence of what had been there before. And there was the divorce. Divorces move slowly, which I had not understood before I was inside one. They move slowly and they require a kind of sustained, grinding attention, even when you are exhausted and sick and would give almost anything to not have to think about them. There were assets to negotiate: a shared mortgage, a retirement account, a man with a lawyer who was going to push on every point he thought he could move. My lawyer, Janet Ortega, was about 5 feet tall and had the kind of quiet, steady intensity that you do not want pointed at you from across a conference table. She was meticulous. She was fearless. She pushed back on everything that could be pushed back on, and she held our ground in ways that I, who was exhausted and sick and grieving, could not always have done for myself. I kept the house. Daniel kept his retirement accounts and a negotiated share of savings and whatever future he was building with Cassandra Park, whose LinkedIn photo I had looked at once, at midnight, in a moment of very understandable weakness. I looked at that photo. Professional, pretty, dark hair, confident smile. And I thought, you have no idea what you signed up for. And then I closed the laptop and I didn't look her up again because it wasn't going to help me get through the next 2 weeks of treatment. In October, 8 months after the diagnosis, Dr. Ewan sat across her desk from me and told me my scans were clean. Clean. I want you to understand what that word meant in that moment. After 9 months of cancer restructuring every aspect of my physical existence, after the exhaustion and the hair and the changed face in the mirror and the hospitalizations and the fear that lived in my body like a tenant who wouldn't leave, the word clean was the most beautiful word in the English language. Priya was with me and she grabbed my hand and burst into tears. I sat in the chair and I breathed. Just breathed. And I thought, very quietly, your body did that. Without him. Your body chose to fight and it won. I went home and I called my mother and I cried for a long time on the phone, the kind of crying that has been saving itself for a while. And then I sat on the back porch in the October cold, wrapped in a blanket, and I looked at the sky turning dark at the edges, and I thought, okay, now rebuild. The rebuild was real and slow, and I did it one small decision at a time. I came back to my work with a hunger I hadn't felt in years. I reached out to old clients. I redesigned my entire portfolio and raised my rates significantly, which was one of the most frightening and most correct decisions I have made in my professional life. Within 4 months, I had more work than I could manage by myself. I hired a part-time assistant named Deja who reorganized my entire project workflow within a week of starting and made me wonder what I had been doing with my time before she arrived. I planted the garden. A whim, one Saturday at the nursery. I walked in with no plan and came home with basil, cherry tomatoes, marigolds, lavender, and a cucumber plant that I did not know was going to turn out to be quite so ambitious. I spent 4 hours in the dirt that first day and came inside with my hands completely filthy and the clearest head I'd had in over a year. I adopted Biscuit in November, an orange tabby with a deeply judgmental face and a habit of sitting directly in the center of whatever I was working on. 3 months later, I adopted Fig, small and gray-eared and quiet, because Biscuit needed a companion and, honestly, so did I. They pretend to dislike each other during the day and sleep in a pile at night when they think I'm not watching. I started therapy. Real, consistent, weekly therapy with a woman named Dr. Reeves who did not let me get away with anything and who said to me one afternoon, very calmly as though she were commenting on the weather, "Lauren, I think you used productivity the same way Daniel used distance, as protection from what's actually underneath." I left that session quietly furious. I thought about it for 2 straight days. I called her back and told her she was right. The divorce was finalized in February. Daniel and Cassandra married in the spring. My lawyer mentioned it in passing. Some paperwork. I don't even remember the context. The information arrived like something that had already been half processed by the time it got to me. A door clicking shut that had been open a crack for too long. I felt a dull ache, not grief exactly, more like the particular relief of finality. I bought myself a good bottle of wine that evening, sat on the back porch with Biscuit in my lap, and thought, I genuinely wish you both the best. And I meant it in the specific, experienced way you mean it when you know from the inside exactly what best of luck is going to require. The months after that were quiet in the best way. Growing. Building. The garden humming back. The business expanding. Fig learning to sit near Biscuit without either of them making a scene. Therapy getting to the layers underneath the layers. A date with a man named Marcus who teaches high school biology and who talked about his students with such obvious love that I thought, this person is good at caring about people. That's a thing you learn to recognize when you've been with someone who wasn't. We saw each other 7 times. I was careful in a way I hadn't been capable of before all of this. Not frightened, exactly, but deliberate, eyes open. Willing to take it slowly, because I now understood the value of taking things slowly, of not filling in blank spaces with the story you want rather than the story that's actually there. I was okay, actually okay, the real kind. 18 months after my divorce was finalized, on a Wednesday evening in November, my phone rang. I was making pasta, a podcast going, half a glass of wine poured, biscuit weaving between my feet with the absolute conviction that something edible was about to fall. It was the kind of evening that is exactly what you need it to be: quiet, unremarkable, fully yours. The number was unknown. Local Raleigh area code. I almost didn't answer. I have a rule about this. Unknown numbers go to voicemail. But something, and I have thought about this a great deal since, this small, uncanny hesitation, something made me pick up. I said hello. A pause. Long enough that I thought it might be spam, started to move the phone from my ear. Then a woman's voice, carefully controlled, slightly tight, like someone who has been rehearsing this and is still not entirely sure. Is this Lauren? Lauren Hayes? Who was married to Daniel Hayes? My hand tightened on the phone. That old, specific animal alertness. I said yes. Another pause. My name is Cassandra. Cassandra Hayes. I was married to Daniel. Was. I turned off the stove. I picked up my wine glass. I walked to the kitchen table and I sat down. I looked at the wall for a moment, and then I said, Cassandra, tell me what's happened. I want to pause here for just a moment because I know what you might be thinking. I know some of you are wondering how I responded to hearing that name, and I want to be honest with you about it. There was a flash of the old anger, brief and very bright, like something that had been sleeping and startled awake. A voice that said, "This is the woman, this is the person." But underneath it, almost immediately, was something else, something I hadn't expected. Because in her voice, even in those first few carefully controlled seconds, I heard something I recognized. I heard the specific seasick quality of someone whose floor has just disappeared. The tone of a person who has been holding something terrible for longer than they should have had to hold it alone, and who is finally, desperately, reaching. I knew that sound. I had made that sound myself. And it turned out that recognition was stronger than anything else I felt. She apologized first. Multiple times for calling, for finding my number, for any of it, and I told her firmly to stop apologizing and just tell me what had happened. So she did. She talked for nearly 2 hours. She told me it had started about 6 months into their marriage. The same drift, the same emotional withdrawal, the same pattern of late nights and distracted presence that I recognized immediately, word for word, as the thing I had also experienced and explained away. She was naturally trusting, she said, and paused and laughed a small, rueful, completely humorless laugh when she said it. She had spent a long time constructing reasonable explanations for things that did not have reasonable explanations. And then she found the phone, a cheap prepaid phone in the inner pocket of a duffel bag at the back of their closet. She'd only found it because they had repainted the bedroom and she was reorganizing and pulled the bag out and it felt wrong, too heavy. She unzipped the inside pocket and there it was. Password protected. The passcode was their wedding date. She said she didn't know whether to laugh or cry when she figured that out, and I told her that was the only reasonable response. The phone had 2 contacts, stored as initials only. Months of messages. Ongoing, intimate, consistent messages that made it unmistakably clear that Daniel Hayes had been involved with multiple women simultaneously, not briefly, not as some aberrant moment, but as a sustained pattern. For as long as she could trace it back in the thread, it predated the duration of their relationship by a significant amount. She said, I need to ask you something. And you don't have to answer. But before your diagnosis, did you ever find anything? Feel like something was wrong that you couldn't point at clearly? Because I need to understand whether this is something that happened after or whether it's been there the whole time. I sat with that question, sat with the full weight of it. Then I said, Cassandra, I found one text message from you. And I spent 9 months believing that the problem was you, that you were the thing that happened to my marriage. It never, not once, occurred to me that you might have been another person in a pattern that had been running long before either of us understood it. Silence on the line. Then her voice, very small, oh my God. I said, "Yeah." She started crying. "The real kind. The kind that breaks open when something has been held behind a wall too long." I let her. I didn't try to manage it. I said, "I know. Take your time." When she was steadier, she told me the rest. Because Cassandra Park, meticulous, analytical, professionally accomplished Cassandra, had not only found the phone, she'd photographed everything she could access before Daniel discovered it was missing. Dates. The scope of the thread. She had assembled with the systematic precision of someone who is in shock but still functioning, a comprehensive record of her husband's behavior across months. She also had a prenuptial agreement. She had insisted on it. She had significant assets. She was a careful woman. She had her lawyer build in a fidelity clause. And she had spent the last 2 days on the phone with that same lawyer going over what documented infidelity meant for her position. It meant a great deal. It meant, legally and practically, a profound amount in her favor. And then there was the loan. While pulling financial records for the divorce proceedings, she had found paperwork indicating that Daniel had borrowed against the equity in their shared home. Without her knowledge, without her signature, the money had gone somewhere that didn't appear in any of their shared finances. And the full picture of where it went came out later, during discovery, and was exactly what I think you're imagining. A separate apartment. His name on the lease. Running for over a year. I sat at my kitchen table with cold pasta and an empty wine glass, and biscuit materialized at some point and settled in my lap, warm and heavy, and I listened to all of it. And every piece of information landed somewhere in my chest with a weight that was complicated and clarifying at the same time. I told her about Janet. I texted her Janet's contact information that same evening with a brief note of explanation. Janet's reply to my message came back in under 4 minutes. 3 words. "Oh, this is good." The divorce proceedings moved quickly once Janet entered the picture. I won't reconstruct the entire legal timeline because it stretched across months and was genuinely complicated, and most of it lives in documents that use language designed to drain the life out of any story. But the shape of it was this. The fidelity clause was triggered by the documented evidence. The unauthorized loan became a separate matter that pulled in financial investigators and involved conversations that Janet described to me later with a particular quality of quiet satisfaction. The satisfaction of someone who has built a career on exactly these situations arriving in exactly this form. What was on that second phone, combined with what the loan paperwork revealed, gave Cassandra's legal team a complete and devastating picture of her husband's conduct during their marriage. And what that picture meant, under the terms of the agreement she had insisted on, the careful agreement that her lawyer had built specifically because she was a woman who understood the value of planning for things you hoped would never happen, was significant. Cassandra kept the house. She kept the accounts that were unambiguously hers. She walked out of that marriage with her financial position protected, her legal standing vindicated, and her dignity, bruised and in active repair but intact. She walked out with more than she would have if she'd been less careful when it mattered. Daniel lost considerably. Not everything. I'm not going to overstate it, because false satisfaction is worse than none, and I've learned to appreciate what actually happened rather than the version that would be more cinematically complete. But he lost enough that it was genuinely consequential. He lost enough that when mutual friends heard what had come to light, and things did come to light, because they always do eventually, they went very quiet in a particular way that said everything without requiring words. 8 months after that first phone call, Cassandra drove up from Charlotte and we had lunch. I want to acknowledge the objective strangeness of this. A Thai restaurant I love near my house. 2 women who met, in the most technical sense, through the same man's deception. Her, 33, recently divorced in the process of carefully rebuilding. Me, 36, cancer in my rearview mirror, business thriving, garden coming back for a second spring. We talked for 3 hours and 20 minutes. I know because I looked at my phone when we stood up to leave and was genuinely surprised by the time. We talked about Daniel, but less than you might expect. Mostly we talked about the pattern, how it worked, how it was constructed, what it felt like from the inside. The specific skill he had for making a person feel like the only one who had ever truly understood him. We both recognized it. We both named it. We agreed that it was a skill, not a feeling, practiced and deliberate and aimed rather than genuine. And that understanding it as such was genuinely different from just knowing he had lied to us. Knowing he had lied was the first thing. Understanding that the lying was structured was a system, was something else. Something that made it less about us and more about him. Cassandra said, "I keep thinking I should have been smarter about it." I said, "I thought that too, for a long time." She said, "And then?" I said, "And then I realized that a person who is very skilled at hiding something is not the same as a person who is easy to see through." I wasn't naive. I was deceived. There is a genuine difference between those things. She looked at me for a moment. Something shifted in her expression. She nodded slowly. We talked about our lives, really our lives, not just the Daniel-adjacent version of them. Her sister's baby, 6 weeks old, who she visited every weekend and who she described with a warmth that lit her whole face from the inside. My business and its growth, the garden which she wanted photographs of and for which I delivered an embarrassing number. The cats. She showed me photos of Humphrey the golden retriever, her dog, 17 images without apology, and I found every single one of them charming. At one point, she put her chopsticks down and said, "There's something I have to tell you. I didn't know it when we first talked, but I know now and you should." She paused. "I didn't know you were sick. When everything happened, when he and I were getting together, when all of that was unfolding, he never told me you had cancer. He told me your marriage had ended because you'd grown apart, that it had been emotionally over for a long time, and that leaving was actually the kindest thing he could do." I looked at her. She said, "He let me believe I was entering a situation that was already finished. I didn't know. I want you to know that I didn't know." I sat with that for a long moment. Turned it over carefully, I said, "He told me almost the exact same story about our marriage, that it had been deteriorating before my diagnosis, that what happened with you just accelerated what was already in motion. He had the same version running in two directions at once." She said quietly, "He had a script." I said, "He had a very good script." We both went quiet at the same time, and then we both laughed. Not because anything about it was funny, but because sometimes the sheer absurdity of what a person is capable of constructing crosses into something that can only be responded to with laughter. The kind that sits right at the edge of something else. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. She said, "I'm sorry for what you went through. All of it. The illness, the way it happened, the timing. You deserve so much better than that." I said, "So did you, Cassandra. Let me tell you where things stand now, because I know that's where you are. I know you need the update. Daniel is living in a rented apartment in a part of the city I don't pass through often. His professional world has been quietly altered in the way that true stories alter things, when enough people eventually know them. His social landscape has shifted. People sort themselves in the end, when everyone has to quietly decide. He is not destroyed. I say that plainly and without bitterness because I think it's important to be honest about what justice looks like in the real world, outside of the version we imagine when we're awake at 3 in the morning planning things that never actually happen. He will find someone else. He may already have. He will make her feel like the only person who has ever seen him. The pattern will run. I cannot stop it. I couldn't stop it from running on Cassandra after me. What I know is that his pattern is his burden to carry, and I have put mine down. I have set it down deliberately and completely, and I do not pick it back up. I want to say something about justice, because I've thought about it a lot. The version we picture, swift, proportional, satisfying in a single climactic moment, almost never actually arrives. What arrives instead is quieter and stranger. It's a fidelity clause in a prenup that a careful woman wrote 2 years before she knew she'd need it. It's a loan document surfacing in discovery. It's a cheap prepaid phone in a duffel bag, found because someone was reorganizing a closet after repainting a bedroom. Justice is a slow accumulation of consequences finding their source. And sometimes the most satisfying version of it is the one you weren't even there to see, the one you heard about later on the phone from a woman you never expected to know. I am more than okay. My business is the best it has ever been. I brought on a junior designer 6 months ago, a woman named Preet, and between us we are doing work that I'm genuinely proud of, which is different from just doing work that pays. My health continues to be good. My garden came back spectacular this spring. The lavender fuller than last year. The tomatoes aggressive in the best possible way. The cucumber situation once again requiring negotiation. Karen and I have an arrangement, tomatoes for sourdough bread. It's uncivilized in the best way. Biscuit and Fig continue to pretend they're strangers. Marcus and I have been careful and honest with each other in the way that you learn to be when you understand what the alternative costs. It is slow and real, and I like it. And Cassandra calls every couple of weeks. She's in a condo that is entirely, uncomplicatedly hers. Her sister visits constantly since the baby. Humphrey has an Instagram account with more followers than mine, and the gap is widening. She texted me a few weeks ago. A Sunday night, late. It said, "I keep thinking about how I almost didn't call you. I was so close to not calling. And I'm so glad I did." I wrote back, "Me too. I didn't know I needed to hear from you. But I did." She sent a photo of Humphrey asleep on 2/3 of her couch, covered in a blanket that appeared specifically arranged. I sent a photo of Biscuit sitting directly on my keyboard during a client call. Some friendships start in the strangest places, and some of the most honest, most useful friendships of your life are the ones you would have laughed at if someone had described them to you 2 years before they happened. I want to take a moment here and talk about something that I don't think gets discussed enough in these kinds of stories. Because most of the time, when you hear about someone going through cancer and a marriage ending simultaneously, the narrative is about survival, about getting through. And yes, that is the story. But there's another layer underneath it that I want to name. There is a specific kind of grief that has no clean category. It's the grief of realizing that the life you were living was partially a fiction, not a lie you told, a lie that was told to you so carefully and so consistently that you mistook it for reality. And when that fiction dissolves, you don't just lose the thing that wasn't real. You lose your trust in your own perception. You stand there looking back at 9 years of memories and you ask yourself, which of those were actually true? What was I seeing clearly, and what was I being shown on purpose? That question, that specific nauseating question, is the one that took me the longest to work through in therapy. Not the cancer, not the divorce, not even the loneliness, which was profound. The hardest thing was learning to trust my own reading of reality again, learning to believe that what I perceived was actually what was happening. Learning that being deceived by someone who is very skilled at deception is not evidence of a flaw in your intelligence or your intuition. Dr. Reeves said something to me once that I've turned over many times. She said, "When someone invests significant effort into making you see something a specific way, the fact that you saw it that way is not a failure of your perception. It's evidence of their effort." I wrote that down. I still have it on a note card on the bulletin board in my office. What I am telling you is that rebuilding, real rebuilding, the kind that lasts, required me to go back and reclaim my own instincts. To remember all the moments when something felt off and I explained it away. Not to punish myself for the explaining away, but to gently, honestly make contact with the part of myself that had noticed. To say, "You were right. I hear you. I'm listening now, because here's what I know now that I didn't know then." The part of you that notices, the quiet, persistent part that registers when something is slightly wrong, even when you can't explain it, even when you have no evidence, even when the other person has a perfectly reasonable explanation. That part is not paranoia. It's not insecurity, it's information, and the longer you practice listening to it, the more clearly you hear it. My instincts now are sharper than before any of this. Not because I'm suspicious. I'm not. I'm more open than I've ever been because I'm no longer carrying the weight of a life that was partly pretend. But I trust what I notice. I verify rather than assume. And I have come to understand that someone who is genuinely trustworthy will never make you feel foolish for paying attention. There's something else I want to tell you about the period after the divorce that I haven't mentioned yet because it doesn't fit neatly into the main story, but it's real and it mattered. About 3 months after Daniel moved out, when I was still in the middle of treatment and the divorce was still being negotiated and I was running on very little sleep and a great deal of stubbornness, I had a conversation with my mother that I think about often. She had stayed with me for a month, and before she went back to Virginia, she sat with me at the kitchen table for a long time. Just the two of us, late at night, tea going cold. And she said, "Lauren, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it without arguing." I said okay. She said, "I never completely trusted him." I want to say that. I never said anything because you loved him and I didn't have anything specific to point to, just a feeling I got sometimes. A feeling like he was performing rather than being. And I told myself I was being a protective mother who didn't want to share her daughter with anyone. But I want you to know that the feeling was there. I looked at her for a long moment. I said, "Mom, why didn't you say anything?" She said, "Because you were happy. Because I thought I was wrong. Because saying, 'I have a bad feeling about your husband' to your daughter who is in love with him is not a thing you say without very good reason, and I didn't have a reason. Just a feeling." We sat with that quietly for a while. I said, "I had that feeling too, sometimes." She looked at me. I said, "I explained it away the same way you did." She reached across the table and took my hand and held it in both of hers. And she didn't say anything. She just held on. I tell you this not to say that we should have known. We should not have been required to know. We should have been able to trust the life that was presented to us. But I tell you this because I think there's something important in naming that both of us, in different ways, had information we didn't honor. And I think the reason we didn't honor it was the same reason most people don't. Not stupidity, not weakness, but love. And the very human desire for the story you're living in to be the one you think it is. You can love someone and still be wrong about who they are. And knowing that, genuinely knowing it, down to the roots, is the thing that has changed most about how I move through the world now. The other thing I want to tell you is about Karen. I know I've mentioned her, but I don't think I've fully given her her due, and she deserves it. Karen Mallory is 61 years old. She has lived next door to me for the entire time I've been in this house. She is a retired school librarian with strong opinions about tomato varieties and a lilac bush in her backyard that blooms every May in a way that makes you understand why people love flowers. Her husband passed away 4 years ago. She has a daughter in Portland and a son in Atlanta, and she fills the space between their visits with gardens and sourdough and, as it turns out, a bottomless reservoir of quiet, practical kindness. When I got sick, Karen did not ask whether she could help. She simply helped. The food on the porch appeared without announcement. The notes, folded small, once, and this one broke me a little, in the best way. She left a single stem of lilac from her bush and a small glass of water on my porch step with a note that said, "Spring is coming. I know it doesn't feel like it right now, but it always does. I pressed that lilac. I still have it. It's in a small frame on my bookshelf, dried and still faintly purple." After I finished treatment, Karen and I started talking over the fence. Properly, not just hello. She told me about her husband and what the last 2 years of his life had been like, and what the year after had been like, and what it had looked like to rebuild something after that. She talked about it with a directness and a lack of sentimentality that I found deeply comforting. She was not trying to make it pretty. She was just telling the truth about what it had been. And in return, I told her about Daniel, about the diagnosis and the withdrawal and the text message and the quiet kitchen table conversation, about the driveway and the strange feeling when he left, about the months of treatment and the slow, hard work of continuing to be a person when it would have been much easier to stop. She listened to all of it. She didn't rush to comfort me. She didn't fill the space with platitudes. She just listened, and when I was finished, she said, "You are a very strong woman, Lauren, and I don't mean that in the way people say it when they don't know what else to say. I mean that I have watched you go through one of the hardest things a person can go through, largely alone, and come out of it with yourself intact. That's not something that happens automatically. That's a choice, made over and over." I said, "I didn't always feel like I was choosing it." She said, "You kept going. That's the same thing." Karen is one of my closest friends now. We have dinner once a week, alternating kitchens, with a running disagreement about sourdough versus homemade pasta that neither of us will ever actually resolve and neither of us is in a hurry to. I am telling you about Karen because this is the part of survival stories that doesn't get told enough. We talk about the betrayal and the injustice and the survival. We talk about the big things. But it's often the small adjacent things: the neighbor with the lilac, the friend who drives without being asked, the therapist who says the one true thing at exactly the right moment, that actually holds you up while you're rebuilding. I had Daniel for 9 years, and he left when I needed him most. I have had Karen for 4 years, and she has never once left. I want to end with something real. When I was in the worst of it, treatment, empty house, mirror, I didn't recognize a future that looked like a wall. I had a very specific fear. I was afraid I had been permanently made smaller, that something essential had been taken from me that would not come back. Not just Daniel, not just the marriage, but something internal, some fundamental belief in being safe, in being chosen, in being someone worth staying for. What I know now is that I had that backwards. What I thought was being taken from me was being rearranged. The safety I had put in Daniel, I found inside myself, not quickly, not easily, in the slow daily practice way that self-trust actually works. One honest decision, one boundary held, one morning you get up and do the next right thing, even when you're tired. The permanence I had believed in through the marriage, I found in smaller, more honest things. My work, which I built with my own hands. My garden, which returns every spring because that's what living things do. The people who showed up for me without being asked and expected nothing in return. And other people's reliability. I found that in the last places I would have looked. In Priya, who sat beside me in too many hospital chairs to count and made it look easy when I know it wasn't. In Karen, who left food on my porch and handwritten notes and asked for nothing. In Janet, who was 5 feet tall and absolutely ferocious on my behalf. In a woman named Cassandra, who found my number in her estranged husband's old contacts and sat for 3 hours working up the courage to call, and then called, because she needed a voice that would understand. And mine was the one she reached for. She almost didn't call. I'm so glad she did. If you've been here this whole time, thank you. From the bottom of my heart, if this reached you. If you're in the middle of something right now that is taking more than you agreed to give, something that feels like it has changed the shape of who you are, I want you to hear this directly from someone who has been exactly there. You are not being diminished. You are being rearranged. And what is being rearranged is becoming something better than what you would have chosen for yourself if you'd been given the option from the beginning. Not easier, not prettier. The more yours, more honest, more solid underneath your feet than anything that was built on a story that was never completely true. Hold on. Do the next thing. Trust that the story isn't finished, because it isn't. Thank you for listening and for being here and for being exactly the kind of person who stays until the end. If this story meant something to you, please leave a comment below. I read every single one and they matter more than I can say. Subscribe if you haven't, and share this with someone who might need to hear it tonight. I'll see you in the next one.